Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good weekend, and welcome back to A Gnome Abroad, where we're still in the Netherlands, although technically at the moment we're flying right on top of the Belgian border and about to cross into the Netherlands, because in today's episode we're going to be following the infamous route of Hell's Highway, the two-lane Highway 69 that the 30th Armoured Corps, spearheaded by the 1st Guards Armour Division, had to fight their way up in Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Right now we're flying almost directly over what is today known as Joe's Bridge, which was the nickname given to bridge number 9 on the Bocholt Herentals Canal outside the town of Neerpelt in the Belgian city of Lommel, just south of the Belgian-Dutch border. It's called Joe's Bridge because the troops that captured it, spearheading the ground element of Operation Market Garden, were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vandeleur of the Irish Guards. Once over that bridge and across that canal, you are effectively in the Netherlands, and Operation Market Garden is underway. And this is where I began my journey the last time I was in the Netherlands, in September 2019, when myself and my friend Roy decided that we were going to have ourselves a little road trip and follow the route of 30 Corps up Hell's Highway, across the Belgian border, through Eindhoven, onto Nijmegen, and eventually a bridge too far over the Nederrijn in the city of Arnhem, with a couple of diversions along the way, mostly to visit war cemeteries. Once we were on the route on Highway 69, which is now called the A50 by the way in the Netherlands, although it's only the A50 between Eindhoven and Nijmegen, but it's effectively built on what was Highway 69 in September 1944. That tiny road, I mean, it's obvious from the air, but it was equally obvious from the ground. This is a terrible road. It was only a two-lane highway, along which an entire mechanised army corps was expected to drive 120 kilometres in 3, at the most 4 days. And it was a terrible road not just because it was only a two-lane highway, but because of the geography of the Netherlands. I mean, look down at that road that we're shadowing. For virtually the entire nearly 120 kilometre stretch of this highway, the road is either enclosed by woods, and by the way, speaking as somebody who has driven up that road and through those woods, those trees come right up to the highway, and those are thick woods. I mean, really thick. You can't see deeper than 30 to 50 feet through the trees. So, in other words, perfect ambush country. And when you're not driving through the perfect ambush country of the woods, you're driving through the perfect ambush country of the open fields, although perfect in another way, because the Netherlands is a very, very, very flat country. We're just flying over Valkensvaart now, by the way, where the first of the bridges that had to be seized is located. But yes, an extremely flat country, which means that anti-tank guns can see you coming from miles away. So as soon as the Germans, and there were a lot more Germans in the Netherlands than anybody realised, although they should have realised because the Dutch resistance had been telling them so for months prior to the operation. But as soon as the Germans realised that a major thrust was coming up Highway 69, all they had to do was position a couple of anti-tank guns, knock out the lead vehicles in the column, at which point the entire armoured column would have to stop and deal with the ambush, upon which they would then have to get the knocked out vehicles out of the way so that the entire column could continue. This could delay the advance by anything up to an hour at a time, for the simple cost of a couple of anti-tank guns. And this was an entire armoured corps, spearheaded by the 1st Guards Armoured Division. It stretched along this highway for miles, and the highway was constantly being cut. They didn't just have to deal with ambushers lying waiting for them up ahead. As soon as they cleared those ambushes and passed on, there'd be more ambushers popping up behind them, stringing the entire column out even further. Now, as far as the airborne phase of this entire operation is concerned, the capture of the vital bridges over water obstacles like the Wilhelmina Canal around the city of Eindhoven here were the responsibility of the 101st Airborne Division. Unfortunately, their principal objective, the bridge at Son, was blown up by the Germans just as the 101st Airborne arrived. This led to a delay of more than half a day as 30 Corps engineers were brought up to build a Bailey bridge over the canal and get the whole operation moving again. Despite this delay, the 1st Guards Armour Division, with the rest of 30 Corps following, were able to make up the lost time and advance on towards their next major objective, the city of Nijmegen. Unfortunately, things had not been going smoothly at Nijmegen, and we'll come on to that later. The most striking thing that I can remember from taking the drive up this highway was the sheer number of war graves that are scattered around the place. There are a lot of war cemeteries in the Netherlands. Now, all of the American dead have been relocated to the Netherlands American Cemetery, which is about 10 kilometres east of the city of Maastricht, in the southern end of the Netherlands, and it is a beautiful place. But the British, Commonwealth and Polish war dead tend to be buried where they fell, so around Arnhem and Oosterbeek you do tend to have fairly large cemeteries. But stretching up the entire length of Highway 69, you'll find that the woods have been cleared back a few metres just to provide a single war grave for the crew of a M4 Sherman tank who were knocked out during the line of advance. Just one small plot with the 4 or 5 crew of one single tank that got knocked out. And these graves are looked after by the Dutch. They are all in immaculate condition. The Dutch remember. And it's not just the older generation. There are programs running in Dutch schools where the school children are given the opportunity to adopt a war grave, and they make it their responsibility to take care of it. Like I said, the Dutch remember. Moving on to Nijmegen. This is where things really started to go horribly, horribly wrong. Now, the responsibility for taking the bridges over the Vaal at Nijmegen were the 82nd Airborne Division under the command of General Jim Gavin. And Jim Gavin was a very good soldier. Unfortunately, he'd been given conflicting objectives. His primary objectives were obviously the bridges over the River Vaal. But the day before the operation took place, he'd been visited by his superior, and I'm being generous to him here, promoted way above his level of competence, General Browning, the overall commander of the airborne forces in the operation. And General Browning had verbally agreed, this doesn't seem to have been written down anywhere, with General Gavin's assertion that one of their priorities should be to hold the Grusbeek Heights, which overlooked the German border, and the Reichwald forest, which could have been hiding any number of German troops. Now, strategically, this objective did make quite a bit of sense, because any German forces coming out of the Reichwald and taking the heights would not only be threatening the flank of the 82nd Airborne, but would also be able to deploy artillery observers to shell Nijmegen and the bridge itself. And this is where things seem to have gotten more than a little bit confused, because the day before the operation, on the 15th of September, Jim Gavin verbally ordered Lieutenant Colonel Lindquist of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment to send a single battalion to the Nijmegen Bridge after landing. He decided there were enough troops for the other objectives. Lindquist later said he understood he should send a battalion after his regiment had completed their earlier assigned targets. Gavin insists that he ordered Lindquist to move to the bridge without delay. Lindquist disagrees. The problem is that if Lindquist had moved as little as a single battalion to the bridge, immediately upon landing, the bridge was only guarded by a dozen German troops. But because of the delay, the 10th SS Reconnaissance Battalion had arrived from Arnhem, 14 miles to the north, and thus seized control of the bridge and prevented the 82nd Airborne from completing what should have been their primary objective. You see, the bridge over the Vaal at Nijmegen, and 14 miles to the north, the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem, these weren't relatively trivial waterways like the Wilhelmina Canal around Eindhoven that could be bridged with Bailey bridges. These were massive rivers. The bridges had to be taken intact, because it was the only way to move armoured vehicles to the final objective. And the breakdown in communication between the various different units of the 82nd Airborne Division meant that by the time the Guards Armoured Division arrived at Nijmegen on time, they then had to fight their way through the city to the bridge, which delayed them by a further 36 hours. This would have fatal consequences for the men of the 1st Airborne Division and the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade at Arnhem, just a couple of miles to the north. Coming in low over Nijmegen, And this is the bridge that could, and should, have been taken by a single infantry platoon on the first day of the operation. As you can see, it is one hell of a bridge, bridging one hell of a river. It doesn't actually look like that in reality. Here's what it actually looks like, seen from the perspective of a captured German 50mm anti-tank gun positioned in the Hunter Park, overlooking the bridge which is today known as the General James Gavin Bridge. This area, by the way, overlooking the southern approach to the bridge, is a particularly beautiful area of Nijmegen, which is a particularly beautiful Dutch city. What we're looking at is just down there. That's where the anti-tank gun is located, next to a restaurant. And that whole area is the location of some Renaissance area, I believe, fortifications. You can't actually see them here in Microsoft Flight Simulator either, they're just covered in trees, but there are also some German bunkers overlooking the approaches to the bridge. And this whole area was held by German troops after the first day, which is part of what contributed to the 36-hour delay in getting the Guards Armoured Division over that bridge. This area now today is just full of some fantastic restaurants. There really are some great places to eat in Nijmegen. But that big clump of sorted wooded area there on the high ground that you can see Microsoft Flight Sim representing as a forest, while it is wooded, what it's not showing you is the fact that that is basically one big fortification. A big fortification that was not held by the Germans on the first day of the landings, but which was held by the Germans because the 82nd Airborne had conflicting ideas of what their primary objectives should be, securing the bridge at Nijmegen or securing the Groesbeek Heights. So, shall we take a look and see what it was that had General Jim Gavin so concerned that he didn't bother to take his primary objective easily on the first day when he could have? The first thing that you have to understand. Okay, that over there in the distance, that's Germany, and that's the Reichwald forest, and there could have been an entire Panzer Corps hidden in that forest, and you wouldn't have known anything about it until they came charging over the plain. And this isn't polderland, this isn't swampy, marshy areas like most of the rest of the Netherlands. That's ground that you can actually drive tanks over thanks to the drainage provided by the heights here. Yes, we are actually looking at the Groesbeek Heights. You have to understand that the word heights doesn't mean the same thing in the Netherlands as it does everywhere else in the world. This is a very, very flat country, and honestly I don't think any part of this area actually rises more than 25 metres above sea level, but when a third of the country is below sea level, this is about as high as it gets. This is what had General James Gavin so preoccupied, and you can kind of understand his concerns. But the thing is, even as we were driving over the Groesbeek Heights, we didn't know that we were driving over the Groesbeek Heights because it wasn't particularly high, until I suddenly spotted a tank and shouted out to Roy, "Stop, there's a tank!" And we more or less completely by accident found one of the best little museums I've ever had the privilege of visiting, the Liberation Museum in Groesbeek. It really is a state-of-the-art museum with some absolutely fantastic displays. And it was while visiting this museum that we did come to understand exactly why it was that Jim Gavin was so preoccupied with the potential threat from the Reichwald. Because let's not forget, he only had one airborne division, and they were mostly armed with just rifles and the occasional 75mm pack howitzer. And there could have been an entire Panzer Corps in the Reichwald, just a couple of miles further to the east. Nevertheless, I think it is fairly safe to say that the 82nd Airborne did drop the ball on the first day of the landings. But by God, they made up for it afterwards. So we're back in Nijmegen, and we're heading along the Waal, west, downstream, miles away from the Nijmegen Bridge. Now, there is another bridge up ahead, but this bridge wasn't here in 1944. There was nothing here in 1944, other than the river. And this is where the 82nd Airborne made their crossing. Now hopelessly behind schedule, and with the British and Poles in Arnhem holding on by the skin of their teeth, Jim Gavin's men stormed across the Waal River in tiny little canvas boats, while under ferocious German machine gun and mortar fire. They got across this river, and this is not a small river, to the island, dragged their boats over the island, and then paddled over the other half of the river, under machine gun and mortar fire the entire time, took out the German defenders, and then without pausing for breath, ran several miles back down the northern end of the Vaal River to the Nijmegen Bridge, where they attacked from the north while the 1st Guards Armoured were pushing over the bridge from the south, and between the two of them they had the bridge captured by nightfall at both ends. Tragically, despite this superhuman effort, it was too late for the defenders at the northern end of the bridge at Arnhem, the British and the Poles, who at this point were out of ammunition, out of medical supplies, and out of water. Tragic though that was, that should in no way belittle what it was that the 82nd Airborne actually achieved during the course of this action. Now that other bridge, the one that is there today, that's a very, very special bridge. You know, I keep saying the Dutch remember. That entire bridge is a memorial to the men of the 82nd Airborne who crossed that river under fire. Every night at sunset, the Dutch remember the 48 American soldiers who died making this crossing, because the bridge is lit by 48 lights, one for every soldier who died. But the lights don't all come on at the same time. They actually come on at marching pace, and every night of the year, a Dutch military veteran marches across the bridge, in pace with the lights, to memorialise the 48 American members of the 82nd Airborne who gave their lives crossing the Vaal. This is the 82nd Airborne Memorial at the northern end of the new bridge. This is the marker stone at the memorial, where I placed an American flag at the stone bearing the names of all 48 of the men who died making the crossing. And this is Piet, a Dutch military veteran, and his sister Dina, with whom Roy and I had the honour of doing that night's memorial march over the bridge in September 2019. So what about the bridge too far? Well, that would be this, the bridge at Arnhem. Except it isn't, because after failing to take this bridge, the Air Force bombed it, and so the Dutch rebuilt it, and they called it the John Frost Memorial Bridge, in honour of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, who was told that he would only have to hold on to this bridge for 3 days, 4 at the most, the survivors of which, after 9 days, were finally given their orders to withdraw across the Rhine. Covered by the Polish 3rd Parachute Battalion on the north bank, by the morning of the 10th day, 2,398 survivors had withdrawn, leaving 300 men to surrender on the north bank at first light when German fire prevented their rescue. Of around about 10,600 men of the 1st Airborne Division and other units like the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade who had fought north of the Rhine, 1,485 had died and 6,414 were taken prisoner. Arnhem itself, of course, is scattered with memorials. That was the Airborne at the Bridge Museum. And this small garden over here, again overlooking the John Frost Bridge, is the Airborne Memorial, and also a memorial to the Dutch Army captain who went by the name of Jacobus, and I'm probably mispronouncing his surname, for which I do sincerely apologise, Jacobus Groenewoud. He was a member of what was known as a Jedburgh team. These were teams from Special Operations Executive who were dropped in behind enemy lines in order to work with the resistance. On the 19th of September 1944, when the defenders at the bridge had basically exhausted their medical supplies and were becoming overwhelmed by the number of wounded that they had to look after, Jacob and a Lieutenant Todd volunteered to make a near suicidal dash across Arnhem to the house of a doctor where they hoped to be able to contact the St. Elizabeth Hospital and arrange for medical supplies to be delivered. Unfortunately, they hadn't gone far before Jacob was shot in the head by a German sniper and killed instantly. Todd was forced to find shelter in a house, but he did manage to make contact with the hospital, only to learn that the Germans had threatened to shoot any hospital staff who attempted to help the British. Jacob was buried, along with all of the British and Polish war casualties from Arnhem, at the Commonwealth War Grave in the town of Oysterbeek, just a couple of miles downstream from Arnhem. And it was here, in fact, that sort of whitish building with the greenish roof just on the other side of the road there on the main street in Oysterbeek, where I found another of the Netherlands' best kept secrets as far as military museums are concerned. That building in 1944 was the Hartenstein Hotel, and today it's the Hartenstein Airborne Museum. It was also the headquarters of the 1st Airborne Division in September 1944. or at least it was by the time General Roy Urquhart, the commanding officer of the 1st Airborne Division, eventually turned up, because he had the great misfortune of heading off on a patrol to try to find out where the hell his forces were, and getting cut off by the Germans and having to hide in the various different attics of the houses in Oysterbeek for a couple of days before he could eventually make it back to his command. The museum itself is fantastic, however. It actually extends below ground 4 floors, and the amount of stuff that they've managed to pack in there is absolutely astonishing. Major General Urquhart's command also suffered a fairly embarrassing breakdown in communications, at least equal to the snafu encountered by the 82nd Airborne down in Nijmegen. You see, prior to embarking for the operation, he'd informed his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mackenzie, that if anything were to happen to him, Mackenzie was to take over. Now, Mackenzie was not the next most senior officer within the 1st Airborne Division after General Urquhart himself. That would have been Brigadier Hicks, but General Urquhart knew that Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie was his most experienced infantry commander, and so he nominated him as his successor if anything were to happen to him, and that was entirely his prerogative. The problem was, this was a verbal communication. It wasn't in writing, and nobody bothered to tell Brigadier Hicks about it. So, of course, when General Urquhart did go missing, and Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie attempted to take command of the division, Brigadier Hicks was having none of it. The situation did get resolved, but it was just the kind of problem that absolutely definitely didn't need to happen. You know, to me the most amazing thing about Operation Market Garden isn't that it failed, it's that it almost succeeded. If you look at all of the other airborne operations of World War II, Operation Husky, the D-Day landings, and so on, they all took months of planning, and were partly disastrous in the case of D-Day, and mostly disastrous in the case of Operation Husky. They planned Market Garden in a week, and it almost worked. And yet it really was almost certainly doomed to failure from the very start. Here's something that not a lot of people know, although maybe the Dutch do, I don't know. Prior to World War II, officers attending the Dutch Army Academy were presented with almost this exact same scenario as part of a training exercise, and they were asked to plan almost the exact same thing that occurred during Operation Market Garden. Except, if any one of them was stupid enough to use Highway 69 as a part of their plan, they failed the exercise. Plenty of these Dutch officers were present in Britain prior to Operation Market Garden, and yet not one person thought it might be a good idea to ask their opinions. But of course, nobody did. And so places like Oysterbeek here are full of some of the most beautifully maintained gravestones. The Dutch remember. That's it for today, folks. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.